Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video we will discuss about a very important motor neuron disease, that is ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or simply you can say Lou Gehrig's disease. One of the very famous scientist, Stephen Hawking, he was suffering from this disease, that is Lou Gehrig's disease or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Now let's talk about it. So what has Stephen Hawking's case shown about the disease? So one thing that is highlighted by this man's course is that this is an incredibly variable disorder in many ways, and on average people live 2 or 3 years after the diagnosis with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. But that means that half the people live longer, and there are people who live for a long time. Turns on two things, that is a motor neuron running the diaphragm, the breathing muscles. So the common base people die is of respiratory failure, and the other thing is deterioration of the swallowing muscles, and that can lead to malnutrition and dehydration. If you don't have these two things, you could potentially live for a long time even though you are getting worse. So what's happened to him is just astonishing, and he is certainly an outlier. Now, what are the basic topics that we will cover in this video? So, first of all, we'll talk about what is ALS, that is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. The next we'll talk about what are the causes, that is what are the basic etiologies and the risk factors that leads to this motor neuron disease, that is ALS. The next we'll talk about the clinical features, that is what are the signs and symptoms of ALS. The next we'll talk about the complications. And at last we'll talk about the ALS diagnosis, means what are the investigations that you can perform if you are suffering from this neuron disease, that is ALS. So these are the basic topics that we will cover in this video. So let's start. So first of all, we'll talk about what is ALS. So ALS, that is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, is a degenerative disease that affects the brain and the spinal cord. ALS is a chronic disorder that causes a loss of control of the voluntary muscles. The nerves controlling speech, swallowing, and limb movements are often affected. So this is the exact meaning of ALS. And the famous baseball player Lou Gehrig was diagnosed with the disease in 1939. That's why it's also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Now next we'll talk about what are the etiologies, that is what are the causes and what are the risk factors that leads to ALS. So first of all, we'll talk about the causes. So ALS affects the nerve cells that controls the voluntary muscle movements, such as walking and talking, that is motor neurons. And ALS causes the motor neurons to gradually deteriorate and then die. Motor neurons extend from the brain to the spinal cord to muscles throughout the body. So when the motor neurons are damaged, they stop sending messages to the muscles, so the muscle cannot function. Now let's talk about the risk factors of ALS. So what are the risk factors? So first and the foremost risk factor for the ALS is hereditary. So 5 to 10% of the people with ALS inherited it familial ALS, that is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. In most people with this familial ALS, their children have a 50-50 chances of developing. The risk factor is age. ALS risk increases with the age and is most common between the age of 40 and mid-60s. Next, gender. So before the age of 65, slightly more men than the women develop ALS. And next risk factor is the genetics. So some studies examining the entire human genome found many similarities in the genetic variations of the people with familial ALS and some people with non-inherited ALS. These genetic variations might make people more susceptible to the ALS. Now next we'll talk about the environmental factors. So first is smoking. So smoking is the only likely environmental risk factor for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. This risk seems to be greatest for the women, especially after menopause. Second, environmental toxin exposure. Some evidence suggests that exposure to lead or other substances in the workplace at home might be linked to ALS. Much study has been done, but no single agent or chemical has been consistently associated with the ALS. The last risk factor is military services. Studies indicate that people who have served in the military are at the higher risk of ALS. So these are the basic causes and the risk factors that are responsible for ALS, that is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or simply you can say Lou Gehrig's disease. Now next we'll talk about what are the clinical features, that is what are the signs and symptoms of ALS. So first and the foremost symptom that you can observe is slurred speech. Next, hoarseness. Next symptom is a difficulty in swallowing. Next, emotional lability, which is characterized by excessive emotional reactions such as laughing or crying. Next symptom is a loss of tongue muscle contour or tongue atrophy. Next symptom is excessive saliva in the mouth. And the next symptom is diffuse spinal tract is a part of the brain that is made up of nerve fibers. It sends the signal from the brain to your spinal cord. So ALS damages the corticospinal tract and causes a spastic limb weakness. And the anterior horn is the front part of the spinal cord. So degeneration here can cause first limb muscles or flaccid weakness. Second, muscle wasting. Next is twitching. Next, breathing problems which are caused by weakness in the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles. And the early signs of ALS may include problems performing everyday tasks. For example, you may have difficulty climbing stairs or getting up from a chair. You might also have difficulty speaking or swallowing, or weakness in your arms and hands. Early symptoms are usually found in specific part of the body. They also tend to be asymmetrical, which means they only happen on one side. So this was all about the clinical features of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Now next we'll talk about the complications. So what are the complications of ALS? So first and the foremost complication that you can have is breathing problems. So let's talk about it. So over time, ALS paralyzes the muscle you use to breathe. You might need a device to help you breathe at night, similar to what someone with sleep apnea might bear. For example, you may be given continuous positive airway pressures or bi-level positive airway pressure to assist with your breathing at night. Second complication is speaking problem. So most people with ALS develop trouble speaking. This usually starts as occasional mild slurring of the words, but becomes more severe. Speech eventually becomes difficult for others to understand, and people with ALS often rely on other communication technologies to communicate. Third complication is eating problems. So people with ALS can develop malnutrition and dehydration from damage to the muscles that control the swallowing. They are also at the high risk of getting food, liquid or saliva into lungs, which can cause pneumonia. A feeding tube can reduce these risks and ensure proper hygiene of ALS is dementia. So some people with ALS have problem with the memory and decision making, and some are eventually diagnosed with a form of dementia called frontotemporal dementia. So these are the complications that you can face if you are suffering from ALS. The next. Now next we'll talk about the investigations. So how is ALS diagnosed? So your doctor may start to suspect you have ALS. If you have progressive neuromuscular decline, they will watch for increasing problems with symptoms such as muscle weakness, wasting, twitching, cramps and contractures. Now, this was about the physical examination. Now let's talk about diagnosis. So amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is difficult to diagnose early because it can mimic other neurological diseases. So tests to rule out other conditions might include first EMG, that is electromyogram. So this is the first test for the investigation or the diagnosis of ALS, that is electromyogram. So your doctor insert a needle electrode through your skin into various muscles. The test evaluates the electrical activity of your muscles, so when they contract and when they are at rest. And abnormalities in the muscles seen in an EMG can help doctors diagnose or rule out ALS. And the next test is nerve conduction study. So this study measures your nerve's ability to send impulses to the muscles in different areas of your body. This test can determine if you have nerve damage or certain muscles of nerve diseases. Next test is MRI. So using radio waves and a powerful magnetic field, or as an MRI produces detailed imaging of your brain and spinal cord. An MRI can reveal spinal cord tumors, herniated disc in your neck, or other conditions that might be causing your symptoms. The next test is the blood and the urine test. So analyze samples of your blood and urine in the laboratory might help your doctor eliminate other possible causes of your signs and symptoms. Next test for ALS is spinal tap, that is lumbar puncture. So this involved removing a sample of your spinal fluid for laboratory testing using a small needle inserted between the two vertebrae in your lower back. The last test for ALS diagnosis is muscle biopsy. So if your doctor believes you may have a muscle disease rather than ALS, so you might undergo a muscle biopsy. While you are under local anesthesia, a small portion of your muscle is removed and sent to a lab for analysis. So these are investigations that you can perform if you have any doubt whether you are suffering from ALS or any neuro. So this was all about a diagnosis. So in this video we have discussed about a very serious motor neuron disease, that is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or simply you can say Lou Gehrig's disease. So that's all for today. See you guys in our next video. Till then, stay connected with us for more videos like this. Don't forget to subscribe and comment below, and yes, press the bell icon for more updates. Stay safe and stay healthy, and yes, thanks for watching this video.